Hello. Hi, welcome. Thank you guys for joining us tonight on a kind of dreary Tuesday evening. My name is Sarah Doty. I'm the Associate Curator of Public Programs here at the Art Museum, and on behalf of our staff and our institution, I just wanted to welcome you and thank you so much for coming. We're so happy to have the opportunity to welcome artist Robert Sestok. Robert is a painter and sculptor living and working in Detroit. His work has been exhibited here at the Cranbrook Art Museum, at the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, Wayne State University, and among several others. Robert is also the recipient of grants from the Kresge Foundation and the National Endowment of the Arts. A mentor to young artists, Sestok established City Sculpture Park in 2014, an art park in Detroit's Cass Corridor for public use and enjoyment. And more recently, he was awarded the Kresge Fellowship in Visual Arts in 2017. He'll be part of MoCAD's exhibition Dual Vision opening in June and has a solo exhibition opening at Simone de Souza's gallery in the fall. Tonight, Robert will be sharing archival photographs and tales from his personal history in Detroit with our musical accompaniment, John Duffy. This program has been made possible through support from ArtX Detroit, a citywide multidisciplinary series led by Creative Many and powered by the Kresge Foundation. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Robert and John. Enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. What you're going to see is a view of my personal history and the involvement in Detroit's Cass Corridor art scene from 1967 to the present. And I'm glad to have John Duffy here tonight to give me some backup. So let's get started. So my earliest recollection as a child in a creative kind of genre was I had a neighbor who had an old antique car that he was working on in his garage, and I used to get under the car when he was working on it, looking up at all of the mufflers and the frame and all these different parts, and I didn't know what it was, but I asked him if he could make me a go-kart, and oddly enough, his brother manufactured go-karts in Buffalo, New York, and so he wrote to his brother, and sure enough, later on, I received a electric go-kart, and it didn't go very fast, and I drove it around, and I'd have to charge the battery all the time, and I got a little bit older, and I wanted to go faster, so I got a gasoline lawnmower engine. And I drilled some holes and put it on and connected it, and I started it up, and it went backwards. And I said, oh, geez, I put the motor on the wrong way. And so that's when I started to swear. I think I was 10 years old. And so I turned the motor around, and I got it on the right way. And I'm driving down the street, and the throttle, I didn't have a gas pedal, but I was reaching around behind my seat to throttle the motor, and the throttle got stuck, and I kept going faster and faster, and I was approaching Woodward Avenue, and I couldn't stop, so I turned the wheel really quickly, and the go-kart spun out and turned over, and I flipped out, and the engine was running and blew up. And oh my God, I thought, well, at least I didn't get run over in Woodward Avenue. So that was my first experience. And later on, I decided to build my own go-kart, and I had to learn how to weld, and my brother had learned how to weld from these hot rodders who rented my mom's garage, and so we had this experience of these guys who raced their hot rods at this drag strip in New Baltimore. We'd go out and see that, and so it was, I think my brother had learned welding from them, and I learned welding from my brother. And this is an example of my brother's handiwork here. It's his race car that he built, the Hawaiian Punch, and he was really successful at it. Here's a picture of my sister with her 58 Ford. She's kind of stylish there. So I had worked in gas stations, and I made enough money to rebuild an old Model A Ford. This is a picture of me and my mother. My mom went to Kingswood, and she was really supportive of everything we did. And in 1965, I graduated from high school, and I got a job at General Motors Truck and Coach in Pontiac as a spot welder on the assembly line. And I made enough money to rebuild this car and drive it to California. And I worked I was going to art school then, and ceramics was my major. So I had a job making slip cast dinnerware at a pottery in Manhattan Beach, California. And I couldn't get into college in California, so I decided to come back and go finish my education at CCS. I had an old VW bus. I painted this American flag on it, and I drove that out to the East Coast later on. This is the kiln room door of at CCS back in the 1967. And in 1968, I was a potter at Pacific Stoneware in Portland, Oregon. And I got pretty good at throwing functional dinnerware and things. So, I thought, well, what else can I do? So I got some slabs of clay, and I took them to a cemetery and rolled them out on tombstones, and then wrapped them around some kind of tube and connected them to these bases. But that wasn't as interesting as these slip cast ceramic bottles that I created. And I thought that was kind of, the funk movement was happening in California, and I think that was what I was trying to be a part of. I also took a welding class at school and created some sculpture. So 1967, I moved into the Cass Corridor in Convention Hall. This is a view on Woodward Avenue. And on the other side of the building was, this was the Verner's Bottling Factory on Woodward. They redid the facade, but on the Cass Avenue side, it wasn't so pleasant, but it was all historic and kind of run down. We had studios up on the second floor. Here I am with Jim Chatelain, Sandra Wink, Gordon Newton, and Jay Shirley. And so we had another photo here of John Egner, Gordon, myself, Michael Lukes, and Jay Shirley. So this is the roof. Out of the windows of the studios, you could get out and hang out on the roof. And down below, you'd hear the high-lows moving the bottles on the pallets. They would be clanging like bells. We paid $200 a month, or no, $50 a month for 200 square feet. And I started to branch out into making images, kind of minimal images on Gordon was doing drawings, Michael Lukes was painting, Egner was painting, I was doing some spray painting. I was just getting started, with my career in fine art. So here's Jim Chatelain in his studio, and Jim was doing a lot of stripe paintings, and everybody was showing at the Willis Gallery. This is Jim and his wife Karen. There was a house on 2nd Avenue behind Old Main that we used to have a lot of parties at, and there were the bands. We'd have a band playing on Friday night. This is the band Shadowfax. They were the local neighborhood group. And this is a painting by Doug James. It was done in Convention Hall. Doug came back to have a show of his work in Hamtramck last summer. I stopped in to see him. And here's Brenda Goodman. She was also had a studio in Convention Hall, and this is her early work. And then this piece here is her more current painting. So the end of Convention Hall, Wayne State University bought the property and they tore the building down. I think it was late 80s. And I had started glass blowing. I kind of got out of ceramics and I thought, well, the glass is pretty interesting. So Arthur Wink and Sandra Wink are pictured here in the center with Marvin Lepovsky, who studied with Dale Chihuly. And Dale was starting a school up in Seattle, Washington called Pilchuck. It was on the Weyerhaeuser property. The Halberg family gave him the land, and he built a glass blowing facility. It was in a cow pasture, and it was surrounded by a forest. So everybody was camping out. Some people had teepees and some people had tents. But it rained for a month straight. And living in a tent for a month is kind of hard to do. But we had communal dinners, and I met a lot of good people. Working for Dale was a lot of fun. We drove back from Seattle to Providence, Rhode Island, where he taught at the Rhode Island School of Design. And we put on a show of his work. I helped install it at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in New York around 1970. Today, Dale has 40 employees and has a studio in Tacoma, Washington, as well as Seattle. And so he was quite an influence on me for a while. I moved back to to Detroit in 1971, and I had a studio on Camfield Street, and that's when the Willis Gallery was starting to take off. So I decorated the gallery for an event with Mitch Ryder. It was a benefit, and the Detroit Wheels. And this is a photo of Mike Luke's painting at the first opening at the Willis Gallery with Gordon Newton. Today, Michael lives in Lewiston, Michigan with his wife, Catherine. And I was setting up my show at the Willis in 1972. These were sculptures made out of wood, covered with tar. I'd read an article in the New York Times about graffiti, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna go make some graffiti. And I went in the alley behind the gallery, and I painted this grid on the wall, and I painted another one, and Eris Katroulis came up to me at that opening. He said, "What did you do that for?" And I said, "Well, I'm making graffiti." And he said, "Well, we don't appreciate that." But, Eris was really, I think, one of Detroit's important artists, and he's had a lot of success with his work. So the Forsyth building was located in the lodge in the Ford interchange. It's still there today. I used to go up on the roof, sit there, look around, and the building was owned by the police department, and my studio was right at the level of the freeway, so it was constant barrage of cars going by, and the noise was relentless, but it was a good space to be in. I was interested in Egyptology at the time, so I built this altar. And Gordy said, "What did you do that for?" And I said, "Well, I just enjoyed it." And so I busted it apart with a sledgehammer, and he said, "Well, that's more like it." So Gordon and I had shared a lot of studios over the years. I think we had 9 places in 10 years. We moved around quite a bit. But so I'd been given some lacquer paint by the DIA. Somebody donated, and I started painting these pictures with it, but it was kind of toxic, and it wasn't very durable, I think, as art material. So here's a little more automotive art, and here's a picture of Gordon. He was looking for a space, and I said, "Well, you can use a corner of my studio." And he brought in some of his pieces and started using the corner of the studio until he got his own space. He had a show at the Hudson's Gallery. I don't know what year it was, around somewhere in the 70s. And this is a piece he created in the Forsyth building, but he had, for his show at Hudson's, cut up a bunch of 2x4s and left them on the floor with the sawdust, and that was his installation. And he had done the same thing at the Willis Gallery, only dumped a bunch of dirt on it. So, Jim Duffy, no relation to John over here, but Jim was an avid fan of the art movement at the Willis Gallery, and this is his company, the Edward W. Duffy Company, his family built. And he decided to collect art from the gallery and the artist in Detroit, and he commissioned me to make this mural, which I called 1x2, which was my description of a triangle, but it's also the description of a 2x4, kind of, or a piece of wood. You can get an idea of Jim's dedication to collecting art in his office. In 1972, he commissioned me to paint the mural in the warehouse, and I used the pipes to as my format for the design. In the pipe shop, they cut and threaded pipe, and the turnings from the pipe kind of influenced me for this particular piece. This is John Egner's painting. It's a poured enamel painting on canvas. And here's another enamel painting by Jim Chatlin. Jim had a show at the Willis Gallery. He painted the walls black, and he had all these color paintings on striped paintings that he did with paint rollers. And it was just fantastic. I never seen anything so contemporary looking as those. Gordon had kind of moved away from doing installations to building things that were really kind of fantastic looking. This is one of his earlier pieces, which doesn't have a lot of sculptural context, but is really very painterly. So in 1975, Jim commissioned me to paint the outside of the building, and I focused on the interior view of looking at a pipe. This was a slab of plaster, which I decorated with other pieces of plaster, and this is a silk screen. I started to do some printmaking. It's an early print. This is probably the last piece I did at the factory. It was an installation. I dipped sponges in paint cans and threw them all over the room. The loading dock, we'll see in the next slide, has a doorway, and I drilled a hole in the wall to see the painting, and it was like a kaleidoscope, so that's what I titled it. In 1974, Gordon and myself moved into the 4th floor of the Boydell building in Greektown, and this was a space that was 4,000 square feet for $100 a month with heat. We thought we had really scored a big space here, and we were kind of happy about it. This is another silkscreen piece that I'd done. I kind of liked the sharp edges that I was creating, but then I started to paint, and I kind of lost it. So I said, well, I'm going to paint over this. And that's the result of overpainting. This is a show. I had my first one-man show at the gallery in 1975, I think, and these were kind of images from the Forsyth building, the cars going over the freeway, and I made a little sculpture out of 2x4s that I painted up. Gordon and I also had a apartment on Hancock that we could kind of, go and make dinner. And below the apartment, there was a little basement area that I used as a temporary studio as well. So I did some experiments with spray painting paint on drop cloths. And I took one up to the Fagenson Gallery. Jackie Fagenson had taken the Willis Gallery and moved it to the Fisher buildings. And that was an example of that. So I think the next image you're going to see is, it's 1976, and I moved to New York City. Lived on the Bowery at Grand Street in this building with Kiki Smith and Steve Faust, and we had Kiki's sister living there, and I made a lot of small drawings and paintings, and Tony came up to the studio to see my work, and he commented that he thought I was acting a lot like Robert Pincus, Albert Pinkham Ryder, and I thought that was a pretty nice compliment. So we used to go to New Jersey and visit Kiki's mother and father, Jane and Tony, and have like Thanksgiving dinner at their house. It was really interesting to see where Tony lived in New Jersey. Today, Kiki has been really successful in her career around the world. She has a place in the Lower East Side and a house up in the Catskills. This is a recent work she's created. So back in 74, Gordon's girlfriend Amy Currier had an apartment up on Forest, and Gordon and I would go up and watch the fights because we didn't have a TV set, so we'd watch Amy's TV. And Amy's family had a cottage up on Boise Blank Island in the Straits of Mackinac. Gordon would drive this old truck up there that we found, and I had to rebuild it because the motor was bad, and we were going to drive up to northern Ontario to see his brother, who was a fishing guide. And so I had to put in a new engine and fix the brakes and put in a clutch, and it was constant work. But we got to the wilderness, and I was shocked that there were no traffic lights or stop signs or street signs. I didn't know where I was going without a compass. But I was pretty good at fishing, and that's how we fed ourselves. We moved back into a new studio in, this is 76, on Cass at Parsons. And down below on the first floor, there was a buffing shop, and these guys were like buffing chrome bumpers or something, and the dust was coming up through the floor, and it was kind of toxic dust, but we survived it. We had a wood stove to keep warm. We had to go out and scavenge wood, and one day we ran a little low on wood, and we threw in a tire, and the the fire department showed up at the door, pounding on the door. What's going on in here? And you know, the smoke went out, and the people in the apartment building next door thought our building was on fire. That's why they called the fire department. That's the wood stove in the back there. So in this studio, I created these collages that I started to be concerned about the picture frame and involving the picture frame into making it into the artwork, and it was kind of an unusual way to make a painting, but I decided to build a sculpture. And this was a show at Macomb College in around 1977. and people could walk through the frame, and it was kind of an interesting piece. But I also, I put it into the collages, so I titled these pine wood decals because everything was glued on to the surface of some plywood. And in the back of the gallery, this is the Fagenson Gallery in the Fisher Building. I had made a assemblage out of scrap material that I had found around the alleys and wherever I could find stuff. These are some drawings I've done at the same time. So I called this Old Glory, and because it wasn't new material, it was old things that were discarded. So some of my influence for doing this comes from the demolition of the city, and this is an example of what was going on in the Cass Corridor. So I had moved out of the studio on Cass to a place on 2nd, and I did these mechanical drawings that were kind of big, 4 feet by 5 feet. They took quite a while to make. I was sharing the studio with Bill McLean, and I think Ray Katz had this studio at one time too. But there was a breakfast place on one end, and on the other end, this was the Ho Ho Inn, and it was a pretty good food, but you had to watch out for the cockroaches running back and forth across the floor. So this is next to Gordon's studio, Sam Pacini Statue Manufacturing Company, and I rented that. And Gordon was still in his studio, but he wanted his privacy, so I got this space, and I had to chip a foot of plaster off the floor so I could use the space. And I had to put in a furnace and hook up a toilet and do some wiring. But I got an old truck, because Gordon had an old truck. Well, I needed an old truck, so I got that, and I took it completely apart and put it back together again, and I was really proud of that, that I had done all that work. At the same time, I was working at Fago Pop to make enough money to do it. Jackie Fagenson's husband owned the company, so I got the job. And these are some paintings I made after I rehabbed the truck, and they used car parts and some fiberglass. Gordon was working with fiberglass, but I thought it was more like painting. And then I kind of was paying attention to windows that had been soaked up and the stores were closed. And I thought, this is an interesting kind of image, So I did this commission for the children's lunchroom, only it was really dark and it was kind of depressing, but I'm sure they enjoyed it somewhat while they're eating their lunch. There's another silk screen with some paint through it. So I think it was around 77, I did some drawings of, after I did the mechanical drawings, I started to draw some drawings of the city of Detroit, cityscapes. And I had seen this Philip Guston show at Gertrude Castle Gallery, and he did a lot of dots for windows, and I kind of went hog wild on that and put dots everywhere. But I don't stay in one place too long, so I started to make some abstract sketches. I'm still working at Fago Pop, but I rented a studio down on Shane by the river from a friend of mine, and I created these recycled can paintings. I called them Meogesic, and I was working at Fago Pop, and there were lots of things that they threw away, but also there was a lot of trash out in, by party stores. There you'd see bottles and cans everywhere. So this was a example of recycling that I got into. I thought that I was trying to make a principle out of it. This is John Igner's boat that I purchased from him when he moved to New York, and had it on Fox Creek on the east side of Detroit. And I used to go fishing. After we caught some fish, we'd go water skiing. And I lived in a boathouse along the river for a short time. This was the summer of 1980, I think. But I was really influenced by being down on the river, the architecture of the buoys, and I did a lot of drawings of things on the river, people fishing, and the boats. So I think it was getting toward the fall, and I decided that I better get inside and get warm, so I rented a studio in the Bernhardt building at 3rd and Grand River, and other artists were living there as well. This was across the street from Cass Tech. And the building that was across the street from our studio was being torn down, and I was really kind of curious about the old man that lived up on the 2nd floor, and he was putting newspapers in the window to keep the cold air out. And I don't know what happened to him, but the building was demolished. And I think artists in general kind of pay attention to stuff like that. So I put it into my monoprints that I was doing at the time. And I think this was an extension of the silk screens that I had done over in Greektown. So Jean Hudson came through the building on an art tour, and she saw what I was doing, and she commissioned me to do a poster for the art train. And so as a result of that, I created some drawings and some prints and collaged it together, and this is the result. This is celebrating the 10th anniversary of the art train, and I presented it to the governor of Michigan down in front of the Renaissance Center on a train. The train was down there. So in 1980, I married Pat Soderberg, and this is Kathy Clifford, Jim Chatlin, Diane Carr, and Danny Carr. They came to the wedding. And Jim had gone through some changes with his painting. I thought these were very interesting works of art at the time. He had been making abstract paintings, and now he was doing some impressionist figurative work. I was also at the time asked to curate a show at the Detroit Artists Market, and these are the people that were in the show at the time. At the same time, Gil Silverman showed curated a show at the Focus Gallery in Detroit, and on the right is Jim Duffy, and he showed his photos of abandoned buildings in Detroit, which were quite interesting. I think he was an artist as a young man, and he had conveyed that to me, that he had painted a mural in his school library when he was a kid. So I had a show at the Race Street Gallery in Grand Rapids with some collage pieces I created, and these they had quite a big space, so I didn't have enough work to fill it up, but it was interesting. Today the Race Street Gallery is the UICA museum in Grand Rapids. So here's a collage type sculpture that came out of this period of work that I was doing. There was a show at Cranbrook called 21 Artists from Detroit. I think it was right after the Kick Out the Jams show, but these were the pieces that I exhibited here at Cranbrook. And I think they were at the Fagenson Gallery as well. So I had a desire to start welding again, and I have all this information now about how to make art, I thought, and I didn't have much money, so I would get, scrap metal and put it together. And at the time, I moved from the Bernhardt building. Pat and I lived over on Willis and 3rd Street. This used to be a resale shop on the corner of 3rd and Willis, and it was torn down, and I captured this action picture of the demolition. A block south on Alexandrine was the Party Store, and that was demolished later, and this was my house that I had bought in 1982. It wasn't in very good shape, but I didn't pay much money for it. And the back wall had caved in, so I had to learn how to be a bricklayer. And there was no studio behind the house, so I had to come up with a plan to have a studio. Gordy's brother came down from UP, and he brought this old wood stove we had cooked on, and it would keep the kitchen warm on a cold day. And this is 3rd and Forest, home of the Dally in the Alley. And here's my neighbor Alan Churgis's house. Alan was a lawyer and attorney in the Cass Corridor. He bought this house for $4,500. It was full of antiques. It was pretty interesting. Alan named the Dally in the Alley. He started that going, and he also restarted the Willis Gallery as an alternative co-op. Here's the second sculpture I created from some old boiler parts that I've had torn out of the house, and some of the pieces of metal and piping. This is a plan to build the studio behind my house on Willis, and I kind of used an old window frame to frame the picture. This was ink and paint on paper. I had got a little carried away with my design and kind of went into an abstraction, but the outcome was that I invited all my friends to come and help me build the building. I had gotten a grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, so I had the money to do the job, and I got a keg of beer and a case of steaks, and we raised up the structure in one day, and then the next day everybody was so hungover, it took a little more effort to get people to come and help put the roof on. And I had paid back everybody that came to help me. I helped them equally for the same amount of time as they helped me. 1985, I was invited to be an artist in Sculpture Chicago, and I designed a sculpture of a fist as an armature. I know we had a fist down at Jefferson and Woodward, but my idea was to make it into an armature, and I had no idea how to do it until I got there. I rented a pipe bender, and I didn't right know how to use it because it was hydraulic, and I broke it twice. Every time it was $1,500. They weren't very happy with me, but I got the job done. This sculpture weighed about 3,000 pounds, and it took about 8 weeks to make it. There were 10 other artists in Sculpture Chicago. And this is my friend Scott Pfaffman, who was from Brooklyn via down south in Alabama. And Scott built this piece called Yo Sculpture. He was also working for Mark de Souvero, setting up sculptures. And so Scott had a little campsite where he cut a oil drum into a barbecue pit, and we would sit around and have barbecues every night down in Chicago. This was a 10-acre site. Other artists were creating adobe structures and landscape design. We had also Bob Wade, Roy Rogers' nephew, created a giant snake, and this was Billy Lawless's stage setting. So I came back from Chicago and made these sculptures at the studio and had a show at the Fagenson Gallery in the Fisher Building again. This was probably in 1986, I think. In 1986, my daughter was being born, and I got a grant. Suzanne Hilberry helped me write to the Pollock Krasner Foundation, and I built this I-beam sculpture. Brian Muldoon had a upholstery studio in Corktown, and he said, come on and get these I-beams out of this building I just bought. And that's when I first met Jack White, and Jack was working for Brian doing upholstery. So I built the sculpture and I called it EAM, Environmental Architectural Man, and it was kind of a marker for my daughter being born, Erica. these are figure edge drawings, which kind of came out of the building the sculpture, but also was influenced by my carpentry skills, working on houses, and I was always in rooms and doorways and windows and seeing these spaces. So I had created sculptures that were out of the drawings. And my friend Scott Pfaffman was the curator of the Brooklyn Waterfront Artists Association sculpture shows under the Brooklyn Bridge at the Empire Fulton Ferry State Park. So I had taken a selection of these pieces and put them together for this show. Scott ran this show for about 10 years, so I took other pieces as well. I think it was the following year, or maybe in the fall, that I was invited by Ann Michalowski to be a part of the Michigan Artists grant to come out and work at Kindy High School with the kids in the welding shop. And we created a farm-like sculpture. They were all farm kids, and they bring their tractors to weld the plows to school. But they were really pleased with making the sculpture, and they put it in front of the school. It's still there today, I think. So Ken and Ann Michalowski lived in Grindstone City, not far from the high school, and Ann is behind Gordon here with and Ken is printing at the press. Gordy did 500 postcards, and Ken would mail them out to people along with poems that he printed by Allen Ginsberg and images of Philip Guston painting or drawings. And they lived in this old general store in Grindstone City, and the general store was actually the company store for the Grindstone Company. The walls were made out of grindstones, and they were like 2 feet thick. It was really an interesting place. So I had been asked to be an artist in resident at the Pewabic Pottery and put on an exhibition. And I did these hand-built constructions, but I had also needed some dinnerware, so I fired up my skill from being a potter and threw some plates and some bowls and cups and things like that. At the same time, I'm also making these figurative sculptures, and I had a show at the Fagenson Gallery again in the Fisher Building. Jackie had helped me get this sculpture put in on the boulevard at 3rd Street. It took 6 years to get it approved from GM and the New Center and the city of Detroit, and so that was interesting. This is a show, this is a piece of, I changed my format from the figure edge to doing heads, and this is Mary Preston. She worked for Jackie, but after Jackie passed away, Mary moved the gallery to Birmingham. It happened to be in the old dentist office where I had my wisdom teeth pulled out, which I thought was kind of odd. But this is Paul Schwartz's work. And so Paul and I had a show at Mary's Gallery in Birmingham, and I brought up this piece that I had created while it was influenced by being in Germany. So I had a show in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and this is Scott Pfaffman's building on the left, way in the back there. Today, Scott and Florence are divorced, but Florence has been running the gallery all these years, 30 plus years. And this was my show back in 1986, I think, around then. And I just took in a bunch of drawings and put them up all over the place. Some were painted. I invited everybody who lived in Detroit that moved to New York to come to the opening. Today, Florence has shown over 250 artists' work, and she has quite a collection of prints and drawings. And this is an example of one of Florence's prints. Scott has moved down the street. He has 2 children with his wife, and Molly and Scott own this record shop and their home in back of the record shop, and Scott's studio is in the basement. I invited Scott to come and show some work at the Lincoln Street Art Park, and in return, Scott had invited me to come and make a bicycle rack at the Socrates Sculpture Park opening back in the day. I can't remember when it opened, but this is another piece, a headpiece that I took to Fulton Ferry Park under the Brooklyn Bridge, and here's another one that I took. So I had been hauling my work back and forth from Detroit to New York, but I invited Scott to come to Germany, and seeing as how he's German, he fit right in, and it was a show organized by Al Hebert through George Edel, who was they were both Common Ground artists. George had moved back to Germany. And the Culture Forum Imbus was the first gallery in Germany that Joseph Beuys had an exhibition in. So I was kind of thrilled to do that. I called the sculptures Gothic Parallax because of being in Germany. I thought of German architecture and how powerful it was. This is a drawing of nuts and bolts, and so I decided I would do a little sculpture to see how that looked. It was kind of interesting. There was a show at the DIA called Interventions, where artists got to select a piece of art to hang their work next to. This is the piece that I hung next to Marsden and Hartley's log jam painting for the show. And Gordon said, this Marsden Hartley painting is really the cat's meow. And so I thought, well, I'm going to hang my art next to it then. I had organized a show on 3rd Avenue in the old furniture warehouse called the Weber Building, and the newspapers were on strike. So I had made these collages of letters and overprinting them, and I titled them Strike. Here's some drawings for the poster I thought might be suitable for the Jazz Fest down on Hart Plaza. I used to love listening to the radio, and you could hear the concerts live. I also saw that you could have a Ringo Starr credit card. And I thought, well, damn, I'm going to create my own credit card. So I cut out this piece. Dennis Naraki had a show at the Center Galleries. He was the curator. It was called Goddesses, and he invited me to be in it. I made these images and collaged them all together for the show. The heads piece, I changed the format of it a couple of times, and I came to a conclusion with it and was in a show at the University of Michigan in Dearborn, but that's where it is today. This is my wife Pat, my daughter Erica, and our two dogs, Betsy and Fuji. Well, we moved to Royal Oak to get Erica to go to high school, and I had this studio in the garage behind the house. I was painting these tree paintings, and I asked Michelle to help me curate this show at the Detroit Club. I took all these paintings that were 12 feet long and carried them up to the second floor of the club for the show. And it was interesting. I kind of got off of the trees for a while and painted some flower paintings. And after that, I decided I would just make some abstractions. And I kind of thought these were probably the most successful attempts at working with the acrylic paint that I had experienced. Sculpture Park. Oh my goodness. This is one of my favorite drawings. It was about being a carpenter and building structures. This is a shot of my workbench in the studio. And this is the wood stove I use to keep the studio warm. This is a abstraction sculpture. These are some other maquettes that I made. I created this piece called Filigree. I had rearranged it a couple of times, but this is the final piece. And this is a piece called On the River. I was kind of trying to catch the rhythm of the water. I had a commission for Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and I built this cylinder for that. I read an article in Metro Times magazine about Finnish people building effigies and lighting them on fire. And I wanted to do that, so I went out to Pennsylvania to Lookout Sculpture Park and built this effigy. We had to get the fire department to approve it, though. It didn't want to set the countryside on fire. This is a commission for the Loginskys. It's an abstract piece. I was able to use new metal to make this piece, which was different. This is old number 7, 7 sculptures welded together. I think it's one of my favorite pieces. And here's a piece called Freeform 5. It's in the collection of Wayne State University. I'd done a commission for the Academy of Sacred Heart with these flowers. It was welding bronze, and this is a bronze casting that was welded as well. So I had met this friend of mine, Nicole McDonald, who was doing street art, and she kind of influenced me to get going on some street art, and I made this painting on top of the auto shop of the school that was 100 feet by 80 feet. It was off of Grand River and Canfield. And it took me about a month to do it. I just worked on the weekends. But it was like, quite a large piece. I think the largest one I've ever done. And this is a view of it from Google Earth. Here's a painting I showed at the Johansen Charles Gallery. It's kind of an abstraction. I think these might have happened after the rooftop painting. I thought these were interesting pieces as well, a little more structural. I really like this piece. It had a lot of work into it. I think that's something that I learned from Mike and Gordy, is not to stop working, but to keep working on the images. So I had done this installation on building on Alexandrine and Woodward. This was really prominently displayed, but it was done on visqueen, and the wind blew out the visqueen, so it didn't last very long. This is a painting at the Yes Farm, and it was called the Eiffel Tower. And so I was kind of fascinated by how big the Eiffel Tower was, and I was deconstructing it and making it into my own idea. I created some paintings using tin foil and some glue with paint and drawing into it. And then I created these tin foil sculptures to change the nature of the rusty metal. And it really worked well, I thought, but it was a little spacey. So I paid a visit to the Hub bicycle shop on Cass Avenue in Midtown Detroit, and they had, I was really taken by the huge amount of bicycles that they had in the second floor. I abstracted the idea in a drawing here a little bit, and then I was making these prints. So I thought that I would take the bicycle images and then combine them with the figurative image. And I thought that was a good thing as well. These are just narrative images. It was cold in the winter months of 2011, and I went into the basement because I didn't have a lot of wood for the stove, and painted these paintings, kind of like an extension of the prints that you just saw. They were, I thought, pretty interesting. These are some one day I made 4 sculptures. I made 1 sculpture every day, and then I exhibited them at the Zeitgeist Gallery that was down on Michigan Avenue. I put them there in the flower boxes. This is a piece that's kind of abstract, but with gears in it, and I thought it was very mechanical. Kind of, this is also a little mechanical looking to me. It's like the continuity tower that Jackie Fagenson had helped me place on the Grand Boulevard. So my friends, the Nymans, commissioned me to make a sculpture for their building in Birmingham, and I had created it in a couple of different models, and I chose one to duplicate it, and this was a stainless steel piece. I think that was 14 feet tall. This is, my friend Gretchen bought this from the show at the CCS Gallery from Michelle, and that was the new gold standard. So this is a drawing of the MC5 that we used to go visit, see them play at the Grandi Ballroom back in the 70s. They played at the show that I curated at the Forsyth Building. This is designed for a mural on a building on 2nd Avenue, which today is Selden Standard. And it was a, pretty prominent figurative mural that I put up. And the building was sold to the restaurant, and so they started to deconstruct the figure a little at a time. And that's what happens to a lot of street art. It just disappears. By the way, the Edward W. Duffy company that I had painted the mural on, it stayed in existence for 40 years, was recently demolished for the Gordie Howe Bridge. So not even something significant as that lasts forever. John Agner helped me construct my studio, and he moved to the Catskills, and he bought a house with a barn. He had his own studio in a barn as well. And there's Jim Chatlin, and Jim moved to the Catskills, and he built a barn-like studio for himself. And so people build studios. This is a design for a studio that I built currently on Farnsworth Street in Detroit. And so I tried to picture how the studio would look in the neighborhood. And this is the studio today. I have a lot of artwork, and I'm always concerned I can't show it all. So I thought I'd put it all in the center of the gallery. And I worked with Michelle at CCS to create this installation where all my paintings would be shown in the gallery, but not on the walls. So I used the paintings to create the walls in the center of the gallery. And I thought that was a novel idea. And I'd even created a little musical backdrop for it as well. So in 2013, Rob Honest came from New Zealand, and he asked me if I knew where he could find a studio, and I told him 333 Midland, and he bought this building, and we renovated it. And after the renovation, I curated this show of big paintings. I invited 50 artists to come in, and I stretched canvases for everybody, and it was quite a good show. This is Gary Mayer on the right and Kevin Joy's painting on the left. Here's Gilda Snowden. I stretched her painting for her with a hammer stapler. She said, "What in the heck is that? I don't know. What is that thing?" And she went out, and the next day she said she bought one. So that's kind of cool. This is my piece for the big painting show. It's 12 by 18 feet. It's a picture of Andrea with her tattoos. And I had been commissioned to do a piece for Ford Field Office of Car Parts. When I delivered the piece, they said, "Are those Ford parts?" And I said, "Yeah, they are." This is my Photoshop kind of design for Cadillac Square. I thought that it would be an interesting addition to the city. And it come to find out, Bob Dylan was a welder, and he welds gates together for people. And I found that fascinating. And I had made a gate for somebody, and I make gates for myself. I don't do it all the time, but I enjoy doing it. I've got over 5,000 drawings, and I don't know how to show them, but I've created a grid where I post the drawings for people to see. And I go through a lot of different changes with my art and my ideas about art. And I like making proposals for things. So I made a sculpture park in Midtown on Alexandrine and the Lodge Freeway. And I had a dream about it. You know, I was cutting the grass on this vacant lot to keep the neighborhood looking good, and I said, "Why don't I buy this?" And that's what I did. I bought the property, and I moved all of my sculptures onto the land. I asked my friend Nicole, I said, "What am I going to call this place? You know, sculpture something or other." And she says, "City Sculpture." And so that's how we named the park. And every year we've had a celebration of the park, and we have people coming all over, and Ethan and Gretchen have performed in the park as well as many other musicians. And I just love seeing my work out in the city like that. We also have a lot of visitors to the park, kids and groups. Here's a more recent piece. I call this Gary's Magic. I kind of made it out of a propane tank, 500-gallon propane tank that I cut up. You'd never know it was a propane tank. And this one I made for a show at the 333 Midland. It's called Midland Steel. So I had the sculpture in my backyard that I made when Erica was born, and I got a grant from the Kresge Foundation, and I proceeded to dismantle the sculpture, and I moved it into the park. I had to hoist it all up using scaffolding and weld it back together, and pour the foundation. It was a lot of work to do that. So it's 2016, Jack White calls me on the phone and says, Bob, can you make a mural like you did for Jim Duffy? And I said, yeah, can I paint, I'm gonna work up the design. I painted his picture playing the guitar. He didn't want that. He said, no, that's not what I want. I want a design like you did for Jim Duffy. So I painted the image I had. Jonathan Rajeski helped me, and we laid out the work. It's really difficult painting accurately on bricks, but I think the piece came out good, and it's like the assembly line of records that I titled it 3345. At the opening, one of the fans came and showed me her fingers, and I go, wow, that's something. So Jack wouldn't let me paint his picture on the mural, but I said, Jack, can I paint your portrait? He said, yeah, no problem, go ahead. So I had bought 100 feet of canvas, and I made 10 foot by 10 foot paintings that I free-handed, paintings of Jack's portrait, and some I projected to kind of make them look like Jack. And I'm going to show those at some point. But last year I had a show with Michael, Lukes, and Catherine at Simone de Souza Gallery. Catherine is a printmaker. She is the one who's responsible for me getting interested in making prints. She taught printmaking at University of Michigan for years, as well as making a film about the Cass Corridor. And if you haven't ever seen this film, it's just amazing what she had captured with the artists in Detroit. This is a sculpture of car parts that I created for Bob and Julie Hertzberg in their loft at the M1 racetrack in Pontiac. And I really spent a lot of time doing that. And I kind of got interested in using the chrome to build this sculpture for murals in the market at Eastern Market in front of Shed 5, and I called this piece Erica's Dream Cloud. So I titled one for my daughter. I was asked to make a piece for a performance at Orchestra Hall of people skateboarding, and so I created this rhythm ramp painting, which I thought was a nice piece. It's on display now on the 3rd floor of the gallery, and it'll probably be there through June. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and watch your step when you're going out. Oh yeah, and a big applause for John Duffy. Thank you, John. All right, Billy.